Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Crush Live Poker Podcast. I'm your host here, Bart Hansen. Today's episode here for December 13th, 2023. And in this particular episode, I will be covering a half-half mixed game that I played. There's actually going to be a lot of PLO hands in this hand review, but I'm going to always be bringing it back to Hold'em, and I'm going to be covering all the Hold'em hands that I played. So it's kind of a general poker conceptual episode with a lot of PLO, but brought back into general poker and Hold'em concepts. So the first thing that I want to start off with, which I think if you ever are an occasional PLO player or dabble in PLO coming from a no-limit background, sometimes you might have struggled with this a little bit too, is what hands am I really supposed to be like raising from what positions? One of the things that I found, this is just hand number one, is that these games at this level, and the most common sort of really recreational level where a lot of money can be won around here is like 1,000 cap. It's just so limp happy and it goes so multi-way. I feel like it's kind of a different art as compared, it's almost an entirely different game than a lot of training stuff that's sort of put out for online PLO where a lot of hands get heads up. Now, obviously we see that in the difference between like live no limit and obviously online no limit or something like that, but it's much more pronounced in PLO because there isn't a whole lot of Cbet bluffing, basically from what I've found. I mean, there are some times that you can do it, but when you're seeing hands 3 or 4 ways, it's just a lot of, oh, I'm going to bet my hand for value. So you get into these situations where you kind of have some mediocre hands from up front and you're not exactly sure what to do with them because, like, for example, number one, I had 10-10-9-7 double suited under the gun. Now I can raise with that hand and pretty much I might be able to shut 1 or 2 people out that would otherwise limp. And what I mean by that is like if I limped with that hand, maybe on average 4 people limp behind. And if I raised, maybe I'll get 2 callers instead, or 2 or 3 callers instead, or something like that. But what I found was a lot of these guys, like if they're going to play a hand, they're going to play a hand. It doesn't matter if it's raised or not. Like they're either going to limp with it or call a raise anyways, like a single raise. So a hand like this, it's kind of weird because as we will talk about in one of these highlighted hands, when you have sort of non-nut kind of rundowns, it's so important in PLO to get these hands, these types of hands really short-handed. It's kind of akin to playing a suited connector in no limit, but much more extreme. Much more extreme. And that's why it's good to often 3-bet like your rundowns, like your middle rundowns, because they do so much better when you're heads up as opposed to multi-way. You know, as opposed to like if you had a hand like 7-6 suited in no limit, yeah, that hand does better multi-way too, heads up too, but it's not quite as pronounced. So when you have a hand like 10-10-9-7 double suited, I mean, I could really go either way. I mean, I could go to all 3 options. Like you could limp, you could fold, or I suppose you could raise. I'm specifically talking about this type of setup where the hands are where they commonly go like 4 or 5 ways. Now you might say, well, 10-10-9-7, you can just pitch in a 9-handed game from up front. Okay, well, how about like 10-10-9-8 double suited, something like that, right? So what I sort of have been going with a little bit is either folding and or raising if I can get the field somewhat thinned out in a given situation with non-nutted types of hands, where if I have like maybe a speculative hand like an ace, king, queen, 4 double suited, a hand that's good enough to play because of the suitedness, the sort of nutty suitedness from up front, I've sort of been doing more limping with those types of things up front. The other thing too that I've found in this sort of brief transitional period is that unlike in no limit, where you might have, say, like 2 or 3 people limp in, it's very rare to be able to really isolate raise in these specific types of games. I'm talking about loose live PLO games. It's very hard to isolate raise. So if you've got 3 limpers in front and you raise the pot from the cutoff, that's going to get called by almost all the limpers at a way higher frequency than in Hold'em. So you look at a hand like, again, 10-10-9-8 double suited, and you're like, well, this hand plays better short-handed than multi-way, and 3 people limp in, they're like, okay, I'm going to raise it. Well, if 80% of the time the limpers are going to call, you're not actually accomplishing what you're trying to do. And in PLO, obviously it's a very post-flop dependent game, so logically in that type of setup, if you can't accomplish what you're trying to do with a hand like that, then you might want to just stick to straight value raising preflop, like some of the best, double suited aces, like 4 for high rundown types of holdings. What's interesting though is that the times that you do get the fold equity pre-flop is when you 3-bet. So in that particular example, like a 10-10, 9-8 double suited after 3 limps, if I'm not going to get folds to a single raise, okay, I might just over limp and get in there for cheap. However, if one person limped and then somebody raised, or say 2 people limped and then somebody raised, and then I was like, oh, I can 3-bet this hand and get the limpers out and get it heads up, you can see how you might take a hand and over limp with it, but it becomes much more profitable in the same setup to 3-bet it if there was a raise from up front. So that was just kind of the whole thing here. I actually limped number 1. I just wanted to go on a little, where the complexities lie in loose live preflop PLO games, but I actually limped that hand. Nothing really happened. It's just something that I thought was worth a discussion. Hand number 2, this is a hold'em hand. Remember, all of these, this is a 2-5 half $1,500 max buy-in game, sometimes straddled with $25 double board bomb pots that happen quite often, like maybe 2 or 3 times an hour, if not more than that. That was the setup to the game. Of course, I bought in for the full amount. Hand number 2, I raised a 20 from +1 with Queen Jack offsuit, and this guy that I don't know, he was this like Asian middle-aged guy. He makes the call, and we're heads up. Now, people are like, is that an open in live poker, Queen Jack offsuit? It's probably pretty close. I will say if you're new to the site, I have a special place in my heart for Queen Jack, and specifically Queen Jack suited, even though this one is offsuit. And even though I think it's a pretty loaded question when someone say, what's your favorite hand in Hold'em? It's like, pretty much, if you're not an idiot, you're going to say aces is the best hand in Hold'em. But I do think that Queen Jack suited as a driving hand in a single raised pot. It's different than a 3-bet pot, because usually in a 3-pot pot, you're going to get it more short-handed. But in a single raised multi-way pot, I like Queen Jack suited a lot if I am the one with the pre-flop betting lead. Why is that? It is because of the fact that usually you get credit when an ace or a king comes out on a subsequent street, and people tend to not believe you if a queen or a jack comes out on a subsequent street. And because of its connectivity, as long as you have a board that comes out like with where it's like 9 high, you will always have some backdoor equity. So if I raced with Queen Jack suited and the board came out like 9 deuce 3 and I had my backdoor flush, that's a pretty good flop for me, even in a situation where like 3 people have called. And the reason why that is because that type of board is obviously very dynamic, top pair dynamic. I have a backdoor flush draw, but look at the cards that actually help me. Any card above a 9 is going to help me. Obviously, a 10 is going to give me an open-ended straight draw. A king is going to give me a gut shot, and an ace is the ultimate scare card. So the reason why I like Queen Jack is that a lot of times, like if you bet and get a call, if a jack or a queen come, you will get far more calls when those cards come if you barrel again, because people think you're like betting ace king. I think a better example might be like 10 deuce 3. That's a really good one, because now any card like an 8 or above is going to give you additional equity. And you get credit if an ace or a king comes. So it's like the best of both worlds, right? Like you can barrel a king or an ace and get a lot of credit and people just fold out. When you actually make top pair, you get less credit and they continue to call. And there's a ton of cards that give you a bunch of equity, like on 8 and 9 high boards or in 10 high boards. So that's why I have a special sort of love for Queen Jack. Obviously, this is Queen Jack offsuit, but I do a lot of raising with Queen Jack for that reason. So I go to 20 with Queen Jack off from up front. This, like I said, this Asian guy in the small blind calls, and we're heads up. So, and I'm raising pretty much to 20 if I'm not specifying, like 4x if there's no straddle. The board comes out ace 10-3 with 2 spades. I don't have a spade in my hand. Obviously, I flop a gut shot here. He checks, I go 25, and he calls. Like I said, I don't know anything about this guy. Turn is a 6 of diamonds, and it puts a backdoor diamond draw out there. The actual combo of my hand is Queen of clubs, Jack of diamonds. He checks again, and I do think this is where sometimes people get a little bit lazy, because it's ace 10-3, turn is a 6. I consider this an okay double barrel card because it is disconnected from the board. I mean, it does give a backdoor diamond draw. Like if it was the 6 of, say, clubs, it would be entirely disconnected. And it is another card that is below, well, it's a card that's below second pair, but for the most part, it doesn't really connect with the board. And I feel like at this point, the light draws sort of fold out on ace 10 3 6, and you're going to get a 10 to fold if you barrel again. You're not going to get a 10 to fold if you barrel on the flop, but you're going to get a 10 to fold a lot if you barrel turn, or if he's in there with like bottom pair, like 4-3 or something like that. So I actually think it's not a bad card to double barrel on ace 10 3 6. And then if he calls again, it's probably mostly a give up in most scenarios. So he checks, and now I bet almost full pot. I go 90 into about 90. And like I said, once you take that large sizing on the turn and then he calls again, I think it's pretty much a give up, which I'm totally fine with. But then he check raises me to 250. By the way, also too in the notes, I've put in blue the lesson. And there's a little lesson in blue in the notes for each little hold'em hand. And the lesson for that hand is, this is a double barrel. This is a blank. So don't get, I would say, lazy in recognizing that just because top pair doesn't change on the turn, there are still some good low double barrels. And those are the ones that are entirely disconnected from the board. And then there are also situations where you get turn cards that are an overcard to second pair, which are even better. Like, for example, if the board was like ace 7 deuce, and now the turn was like a jack or something like that, you're going to get the 7x to fold out, things like that. So he check raised. Obviously, I just snap folded. Okay, kind of first interesting hand of PLO, and this one is kind of bolded. Now, I don't normally make plays in PLO all that much because I've played 1,500 hours of live PLO, but I thought this was an interesting one in terms of the setup. And again, you got to sort of picture like this is a loose live game where most of the time someone's going to raise for protection with the nuts. And when you get a lot of limp pots like this typical setup, it almost plays like a bomb pot type of scenario where, especially someone from the blinds, if sort of lower types of boards come out where the sort of smaller end straights, like small cards make like a nut straight, obviously the person in the blind is going to be way more apt to have it. So I pick up king 6-5-3 double suited, and I am in the big blind. This hand was actually straddled. So I'm in the big blind. So I was in the middle blind and I completed. So it's right around 4 ways. So it's like $40. The board comes out ace of clubs, 4 of diamonds, 3 of hearts, ace 4-3. I have king 5-6-3. So I have an open-ended straight draw here. And I also have a 3. It's ace 4-3. I've got 5-6 in my hand and a 3. I also have the backdoor nut flush draw. I check, the straddle checks. This Asian guy bets 20. And then from about MP, so he had sort of, I think he was either the first or the second limper. And it gets folded back around to me. So one guy folds, and I'm like, this is a board here. Now, again, I don't really know anything about this Asian guy. I didn't think that he was going to limp in with aces there from middle position. And, the nuts are deuce 5. Obviously, I'd like to have deuce 5, but no, not a lot of players are going to play deuce 5. And I was like, man, this is a board where I have a ton of deuce 5 here. And even if he has a set and we don't get like a board pairing type of run out here, it's going to be really difficult for him to call. And then if he's got aces up, he's going to have to fold out. Anyways, again, it's ace 4-3, and I have king 6-5-3. So I have 5-6 open-ended, a pair of threes, and a backdoor flush draw. So he goes 20. I check raise to 75. Now, again, this is not a common play that I really make. Now, the straddle, who is a big-time fish, and one of the reasons why this game goes, he cold calls. So 20, 75, I go 75 out of the big blind. I think I said small blind, but I said big blind. And the straddle cold calls, and then the MP guy who is the better, he also calls. So I'm like, wow, this is interesting. So now we've all of a sudden put in like 225 here onto the turn, and the pot is like 265. The turn is the 8 of diamonds. So it's ace 4-3-8. Ace of clubs, 4 of diamonds, 3 of hearts turns the 8 of diamonds. So it is possible that someone could have picked up like the nut flush draw here with the ace X of diamonds. But I actually looked at this as a pretty large brick here. And even in PLO, I fired here. I fired for full pot here on the turn. Everyone was 1,500 effective. And then I just knew if people called again, most of the time, if they called on this card and they didn't raise, they are going to have sets, or they're going to have something that picked up the nut flush draw on ace 4-3-8. So even if one guy were to call, it's not a terrible situation for me because I know where I'm at. Also, too, if the deuce or the 7 come, I obviously make the nuts. Now, I fired out pot on ace 4-3-8, and they both folded. What's interesting here, what I find interesting here about PLO, of course, is that if one guy calls and the river pairs the board, I feel like I just absolutely have to give up. I think the same thing with the backdoor diamond. It gets interesting if it was like, say, a 5 that came where 6-7 is a straight, or like a 6 where like 5-7 is a straight, because some of those type, and I kind of make a low 2 pair, but I do feel like I need to bluff those hands. So again, it's ace 4, 3, 8. I have king 6, 5, 3. So if a 5 comes, I make 5s and 3s. I don't beat aces up. And if a 6 were to come, I make 6s and 3s, and I still don't beat aces up, but there's one liner out there to a, well, actually there's no one liner out there to a 5, but 5-7 comes in. I think I still probably bluff those cards, but I think if somebody were to call me and backdoor diamonds come in, I give up. And of course, if the board pairs, I give up. So I think what I can take away from that though too is this is a perfect example where the nuts being deuce 5, I'm in the blind. If I'm sort of putting pressure on people in the field in this limp pot where they're not usually going to say VPIP deuce 5 in their hand, and they're still calling, in PLO, a lot of times the hands that they're calling with, well, almost always, is some sort of draw when they don't raise off by the turn, or a lot of times on the flop. And what are draws in PLO? Draws are sets or some sort of straight draw or some sort of backdoor. So when you're running like a bluff like this, you really want the board to really break out. And that's why you want to do it with some equity so you can actually make some hands as well. So I found that one kind of interesting. It got through. Not a very, very common types of, situations. Next hand, I'm not even going to necessarily go over. I opened king, jack, 8-8, double suited. Here's another example too, where we were playing like 6-handed and I opened that hand from 6-handed from under the gun, and like a bunch of people called. I mean, maybe it's too light, but I was looking at sort of the somewhat of the non-nuttiness of the hands. And obviously in a full ring game, it's way, way too light, but we were playing 6-handed at the time. Like 3 people called and the board came out like jack 5-3. And, basically I was just done with it. That was number 4. Number 5 is a hold'em hand. Asian guy straddles from up front, MP limps, and I go to 50 with 10-9 of clubs on the button. So straddle pot, 2 limps. So we're playing 2-5-10. There are 2 limps, and I go to 50 on the button. And again, everybody is pretty much full stacked with 9-10 of clubs. Now I know sometimes, again, if you're new to the site, I'm going to keep sort of going back and forth at some concepts that I've talked about in the past. So some of you subscribers have been around, have heard this before. But my general approach to raising non-premium hands from late position and hold'em, and when I want to isolate limpers, is that if there are 2 or more limpers from up front and I'm like in the cutoff or on the button, I will usually only raise the hands that I would have raised from the first few positions. So maybe that's like 8s plus, king, queen, ace, jack, things like that. But if I have playable hands, I will overlimp them. 9-10 suited is pretty close. And because there were 2 limpers in front, I decided that I was like, okay, this is a direct suited connector. A lot of times I might be able to get this heads up and it kind of plays well. Now, if I had what are some of the hands that I might overlimp 2 people with? Small pairs, maybe a hand like 7-5 suited, 10-8 suited. And a lot of people sometimes will get on me and they're like, oh, those should just be folds. I don't think so, like in a loose live game, but a direct suited connector with a little bit of high card value. I mean, I open that hand from up front anyways, but it's really on the cusp. And I think where the difference lies is like, say there are 3 or 4 limpers from up front, I might overlimp there, whereas I would open it from up front and I would definitely only raise from late position if there are 3 limpers, I say like 2 to 3, with really pure value types of holdings that I would raise the first few positions. That's my approach. But I think there is some room to overlimp, obviously, in live games. So I go to 50. Fish in the big blind cold calls, like straddle calls and the 2 limpers call. So it's like 4 or 5 ways. I mean, whatever I tried to do didn't work. I think it's 4 ways, including me. I might have added an extra guy in there. And I've got 9-10 of clubs on the button. The pot's $200. The board comes out ace, queen, 3 with 2 hearts. I mean, this is just a pure miss. Absolutely nothing. Gets checked over to me, and I just check it back. That's it. Doesn't even matter what happened, the rest of the way. And the lesson here in blue is this is a pure give up in the Cbet bluffing matrix. Of course, Cbet bluffing matrix is in the coursework, Crushing Live No Limit, 2023 and beyond. We have a whole module on Cbet bluffing, many different episodes. And I sort of came up with this concept called Cbet bluff matrix way back when, almost 10 years ago, that are the factors or the variables of what you want to think about if you are deciding whether or not you want to make a continuation bet as a bluff. And that means that you are the preflop raiser and you are betting the flop as a bluff. The number one consideration when you are trying to decide whether or not you want to Cbet bluff is number of players. And there were like 4 people in the pot. Like there were 3 or 4 other people in the pot. So that's the absolute number one consideration. Usually when there's more than three or more other people in the pot, you rarely Cbet bluff at all. Maybe only in the best types of setups on the best types of boards. And what's funny in PLO is there really isn't a whole lot of continuation bet bluffing, and you would reduce that number down. Maybe you only continuation bet bluff like against one person, but for the most part, if you want to keep it simple, usually I don't continuation bet bluff if there are 4 other people besides me in the pot, usually not 3, but sometimes, unless it's a really good setup. And then your sweet spot is obviously heads up. And then, when there's maybe 3 guys, including yourself, in the pot. The other factors in the Cbet bluffing matrix, of course, besides number of players, is equity, equity in backdoor, equity in your hand, stack sizes, effective stack sizes, position. There's a whole list of different factors, but the number one thing is number of players. And then the matrix part of that is I kind of came up with a system of rating your short-term image, like taking a look at all of the factors of Cbet bluffing and rating the actual setup like 1 to 10. So let's say the situation was like maybe a 5 out of 10, like it was in the middle, like maybe you're up against 2 or 3 other players. It was like in the middle, right? And then you weight that with your short-term image. You rate your image as a function of winning or losing 1 to 10, and then you add those 2 numbers. And if they add up to, say, like 10 or more, you Cbet bluff. So what that means is you might have a situation where it's not a great spot to Cbet bluff given the factors. Maybe like it's a 3 out of 10, but maybe your short-term image is so good, like it's in the 80th percentile, like it's a 8 out of 10. You might actually take that situation and Cbet bluff because your image is so good. On the flip side to that, you might have a situation where maybe it's a 7 out of 10 in terms of the different factors going in where for Cbet bluffing, but your image is so bad, maybe you've lost every single pot, it's like a 1 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10. You add those 2 numbers up, they don't add up to 10, and you pull back. So that's all. There's always extra stuff that goes on. And it's funny, I came up with the Cbet bluffing matrix way before people had talked about like randomizing things. These online players come and they're like, oh, I want to randomize, or you see it a lot in tournaments too. By the way, I'm going to link to that in the notes as well. Take a look at the Cbet bluffing matrix in the coursework. But, you look at a guy and like, oh, I have a randomizer, like according to my watch, or I'm going to look at the clock. And if right now the second hand is like in the last half of the minute, I'll do this, or if it's in the first half of the minute, I'll do that. That's how I'm going to randomize. Like it's a 50-50 situation, and I want to have a pure randomization as to what I do. And we actually saw Doug Polk do that. I don't know if you remember, like maybe 6 months ago when he was at Hun Hustler Casino Live, when that guy bluffed him when he had aces. Guy bluffed him off of aces, like he check raised, bluffed the river, this like recreational player. And Doug was like, I'm going to call with this hand like 25% of the time. And he said, so basically he said the way that he was going to randomize is like he needed to pick the order of his cards when he turned them over. So he was like, he had like black aces. So he was like, if this is the ace of spades here, like I'm going to call, or something like that. And he didn't get it and he folded out. But my sort of strong contention is that you shouldn't be randomizing in live poker. And what I mean by that is that there should always be some sort of extra information that you can really bring in. Maybe not always. Maybe like if you're just coming from an entirely neutral spot and you don't know anybody at the table. But if you are paying attention, there should be some sort of extra information that can weight you towards a decision that would be better than entirely randomizing. In your own image, winning or losing, like if you have a losing image, would somebody be trying to bluff you more or less? And then in somebody else's short-term image, if you're paying attention a lot, like are they winning or losing that might cause them to tilt, that might cause them, if they're winning, that might cause them to be playing aggressive because they think they might run over the table. There is always extra, how are they doing in the session? Are they steaming? There is always extra information that you can gain from live poker. And I feel like I would always want to have the choice of making a decision versus randomizing. So that's kind of how I come up with that like sort of Cbet bluffing matrix. It's a factor with short-term image. Hand number six, oh, by the way, so the lesson here is just pure give up. Like betting this board on ace queen 3 would just be pure spew. Absolute spew. It would be terrible, I feel like. Next hand here, hand number 6. This kid raises. What's funny about this, I say kid raises from MP. He's not like a kid. He's like maybe 26 years old. He's like, did you go to Reading High, which is the town that I grew up in, Massachusetts? And I said, yeah, this kid went to Reading High too. I'm class of 1997 in high school. He's in 2015. So I'm 18 years older than him. But we had some of the same sports coaches, the golf and the tennis coach, same people. So I thought it was kind of funny because we obviously both went to the same high school. I've seen him around a little bit before too. He likes to play this mixed game because he likes Hold'em. I forget the kid's name. But anyways, he raises to, and he was the only other, I think, what looked like for-profit player at the table. He raises from MP. This old guy calls on the button, and I make the call. He made it 20. This guy called on the button. I was in the small blind with ace of clubs, 10 of spades, and I called. And then this fish guy also called in the big blind. So we went 4 ways. And the pot was about $75 after the drop. Now, this one's kind of close here, too. This is a little bit close because you could make a case where you could say, well, remember, it's an open from MP, sort of a crusty guy calls on the button, and I'm in the small blind with ace 10 off. If you looked at a chart, this is probably a fold. And then you might say, well, you should be 3-bet or folding this hand because you get an overlay from the guy on the button and you want to drive the fish out. You could make a case for that. Or sometimes I think you can make a case here for calling. I just think that when you're in a good game like I was, that calling is better than folding. If you want to tell me that maybe 3-betting is showing a slight larger expectation, the only thing I would say though is that OMC on the button that flat called, he's not a wide player necessarily. And the kid wasn't really opening that wide either. So I don't know about my range necessarily against his open from MP, although I will say I kind of squeeze him out a little bit though if I 3-bet. But I ended up making the call, and I think maybe what I didn't take into consideration was how wide this fish guy was playing in the big blind. Because again, if it was close, that would sort of lend yourself to probably wanting to 3-bet this hand. So we go 4 ways. Again, I have ace of clubs, 10 of spades, overcalling in the small blind. And the flop comes out ace, jack, 9, rainbow. So I was like, okay, this is going to be an interesting one. And the thing about holding, this kind of goes back to this whole, if you've been sort of like, I've been in and out of this whole Skalansky, Mason Malmuth 2+2 thread when I made that kind of funny video with those ridiculous hands that they put up as examples with their small stakes book coming out. And one of the most egregious things that I thought was that stupid first hand where Mason or Skalansky overlimped kings from the low jack, like 2 people limped in and they overlimped kings. I think they were trying to limp re-raise and they didn't get it. And the board came out like jack 9-7 with a 2 flush. And so it's a limp pot and like Skalansky's like in the cutoff with kings over limping. The board comes out like jack 9-7. And like one of the limpers from up front bet like 70% of pot and an MP guy called. And then Skalansky just folded kings on jack 9-7. And I was like, this is almost as bad as what was pre-flop. And what people don't, and there's a lot of people in the comments that are like, oh, he didn't raise it up pre-flop, so it's just one pair, so just get out now. That's the wrong way to think about poker. Even if it was a limp pot, you want to think about, hey, how is my hand doing here against the range of my opponents, given the action and the pot odds that I'm getting? If in that example, it was a small stakes game, say the pot was like $10 and the limper bet 7 and the other guy called, the pot was like $24. It was 7 for him to call with kings on jack 9-7. He's getting like 3.5 to 1. So does he have like 22% equity against a limper's lead and call range on this board? Of course he does to continue on. The reason why I bring that up is that a lot of people will make the case with this ace 10 that, oh, it's a trap hand. You could be outkicked. It's a trap hand. And I just say, well, if you know how to read hands and play post flop, it doesn't have to be a trap hand. You can fold top pair some of the time based upon the action. So the board comes out ace jack 9. So you start to think, oh, maybe this will be some sort of trap hand. So obviously I check, the fish checks, MP checks, and now the OMC guy bets. So the OMC guy bets 30 on the button, which I kind of found interesting. Now I'm not going to necessarily, I don't need to check raise here. If the kid had come out and bet like full pot and the OMC guy had called on ace jack 9, I think you could make a case where ace 10 on the flop becomes very close to just a fold. I mean, you do have some backdoors. I would certainly fold like ace X suited. Like if I had overcalled like ace 3 suited in the small blind and it came out ace jack 9 and the kid Cbet large and then the OMC called on the button, I would just fold for sure. But that didn't happen. So the OMC guy bets 30. I call. The fish folds and the kid overcalls. The preflop raiser actually overcalls. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, what is this guy overcalling with? Like, does he have a weak ace or something? Because like, I'm trying to put myself in his position. You really shouldn't be overcalling with like kings or queens here, right? When it goes bet and call, I don't know if you should be calling with, or, I mean, you see it sometimes. I mean, and then he could have draws like king, queen, king 10, something like that. Although I have a 10 in my hand. So the turn's the king of spades. So it's ace, jack, 9, king. Turns a king of spades. And I was like, oh, that's interesting because this guy on the button, if he ever has queen 10 and he was betting it, now it comes in. I check, the kid check. And then I'm thinking maybe the kid once in a while has like pocket kings or something. So I check, the kid checks, but then the OMC checks. Now, if the OMC bet again, I think it would kind of be a function of his bet size because it's ace, jack, 9, king, and the pot is $130. Like if he bet the turn like for 125, I don't think he's ever doing that with like ace 4 on ace, jack, 9, king. And yeah, I picked up a gut shot, but I got the kid to worry about behind him. I think I might just toss it at that point, but that didn't happen. It went check, check, check. And now the river is a 6. So it's ace, jack, 9, king, 6. There wasn't really any draws. There weren't any types of flush draws or anything out there. And I decided to check here again. Now, I was actually thinking at the time, wow, this is going to be really interesting because I don't think my hand is strong enough here to really value bet for a number of different reasons. Number one, there's no front door draw that's busted out. It's not like, how sometimes you can make a thin value bet and somebody might call you down with weaker because they think you busted the front door draw. It's a rainbow flop. It's ace, jack, 9. And then the other thing too is the other draw, the most common draw that's out there came in on the turn. So it's ace, jack, 9, king. So that means that when the other draw comes in, you're not going to be able to effectively value bet medium strength hands as well because you can't get bluff caught by worse anymore, right? Like if it had come out like ace, jack, 9, deuce, 6, you could make a case, maybe heads up, when there wasn't an overcall, from the preflop raiser that you might bet and maybe somebody like convinces themselves that you missed queen 10. But here it came in. So I was like, this is just a check for me. I'm hoping it gets checked down. So I check. The kid checks, and then finally, the OMC guy on the button, he also checks. I say ace 10, and my hand is good. What I actually have in the notes here, which I think is a lesson, is that I think that I was probably going to check fold to any considerable bet here from either player. Like, I think with the pot being, again, it was $130 going to the river. If I check and the kid bets like 85 to 100, or if I check and the old OMC bets like 85 to 100, I think I fold to either situation. On that particular run out, with what the action was, I was probably planning to check fold the river. I can't imagine that I am ever good there. When queen 10 comes in, by the way, on ace, jack, 9, king, I can't imagine that I'm ever good if a for-profit player bets the river after check overcalling the flop, by the way. Or if the OMC bets the river after checking back the turn, because the OMC could very easily have flop top, could have flopped 2 pair on the flop and then is scared of queen 10 on ace, jack, 9, king, and now might be value betting river, like ace 9, jack 9, whatever. And as long as the kid isn't turning king, queen into a bluff, which I don't think is really going to happen, although it probably would have worked in this particular situation, if he was actually thinking, like if you put yourself in the kid spot and you had raised with king, queen, again, this is hand number 6, and it came out ace, jack, 9, and you decided to not c-bet, or king 10, by the way. You decided to not c-bet because it was super multi-way, king, queen, or king 10, and the action was OMC bets, Bart calls small blind, and then you call, right? And now the turn's a king where you make a pair, and it gets checked through, and now the river's a 6, and now Bart checks again. You might have a pretty good candidate to turn your king, queen, or king 10 into a bluff because I don't think you're going to beat both the OMC and Bart. I think one of those guys is going to have an ace, and I don't know what the OMC's hand raising skill is, but like I said, if the kid had bet there on the river, I think I probably would have been forced to fold. Same thing as the OMC. Same thing as the OMC. There's a couple other 7 and 8. There's a couple other small PLO hands that I'm not even going to necessarily talk about. So if you want to take a look at them in the notes, you can just look. Hand number 9. Hand number 9. And I think this is probably the most interesting hand of the entire session. And as I can see the time, we're definitely going to go into 2 episodes here because we haven't even covered half of the hands. But this was the most interesting hand of the entire session. And I kind of want to bring it back a little bit to comparing it to a little bit no limit preflop, and how these situations are more extreme in PLO. So in this particular hand, it was somewhat of a new villain. And one of the things that I noted about the villain was that he was trying to get into the 2-2 PLO game and there was no seat. So he took a seat in 2-5 in the mixed game. And you will sometimes see this in live poker. This is a dynamic of live poker. I know Michael G talked about a lot about live dynamics in his second Race to the $5 Blind, Big Blind podcast this week. But especially if you're in a room where there probably are a limited amount of tables, you will see somebody maybe play in your game that is waiting for one game lower. And normally, those guys tend to play a little bit more on the passive side if they're playing up a level. So these are the types of things that you want to sort of like pay attention to. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about with what happened here pre-flop. So I definitely made something of note with that. But he had won. He had started off, this is another thing, with like 500. He had started off with like the minimum, and he had won a big PLO hand, and now he was sitting with 1,600. And that can happen sometimes too. More common in PLO for somebody to run it up, but it can happen in Hold'em as well, where a guy, you're playing 2-5, and a guy sat down with the minimum because he's waiting for like the next game lower, like a 1-3, and he bought the minimum and he got doubled up, and now all of a sudden he's sitting there with a big stack, and he probably doesn't have that much experience with it, and maybe he doesn't want to lose his entire stack. He's up $1,100 in profit. So how would I attack a guy like that? Well, in Hold'em, if he ever like double flatted and sort of capped off his range pre-flop, of course, double flatting means like somebody raises, he calls, then we 3-bet, and then maybe he calls, so he goes call. And we've talked about how that's a very sort of capped range pre-flop because he's probably not going to have ace king, aces, kings, something like that. And you can sometimes triple barrel guys like that or a double flatter off of a hand on a high board like ace king 3. If someone's going to always 3-bet ace king, aces, and kings, and it comes out ace king 3 and they double flatted, they're not going to have those hands. The best hand they're going to have is like pocket threes. And if a guy who was waiting for a smaller game flops a set, he's probably going to raise it off by the turn. So if you bet the flop and bet the turn, he probably doesn't have a set. We know he doesn't have ace king. So the question is, like, does he want to play for his entire stack with like a single paired ace? I'm saying if you were running like a triple barrel. But even more highlighted is a guy who wants to play down and want a big hand. So bringing this back to PLO, this is the setup. 1,600 effective, and it gets folded around to the small blind, and I am in the straddle. So we're playing 2-5-10, I'm straddling. Everybody folds, which was a rare situation. Small blind completes, okay? And this guy, he was a little bit younger than me, in the middle, in the big blind, he raises to 40 in the big blind. And I look down in the straddle, and I have 8-7-5-4 double suited, 7-8-5-4, 4-5-7-8 double suited, hearts and clubs. So this is a middling rundown hand. Now, obviously, there's a gap in the middle. And this is what I'm talking about, sort of bringing it back to Hold'em. If we were in a situation in Hold'em and we had like a hand like 7-6 suited, yeah, we would probably want to be doing a fair amount, I would say, of 3-betting here. A fair amount of 3-betting to drive out that sort of small blind complete. But just because the small blind completes doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to call the raise. But my point is, it is far less critical, I think, in Hold'em. I think you could sometimes call with 7-6 suited in this setup. Whereas with my hand in PLO and with the tendency for people to like to go multiway, meaning that I think the small blind is probably going to be limp calling a lot more than maybe in Hold'em because people love to see flops in PLO. I think it's far more critical here for me to play this as a 3-better fold, and I'm not folding it. I wanted to get that guy out of the small blind to promote the non-nuttiness of my hand. Because if I just call with 8-7-5-4 and the small blind comes in, if I flop like a pair and a flush draw, I can't go with it because my suits are so low. But if I get it heads up and knock that guy out, I'm in a much, much better position. The other thing too is that if this guy has a hand like aces, which is very common in PLO, I mean, I think the other thing too is that as you compare the games, people raise a lot less pre-flop in a live setup in PLO. And when they do raise, it skews them towards these hands. Whereas like in Hold'em, he might raise with like, queen jack suited, king jack, something like that. Not really the equivalent I think, in PLO where they're just going to complete with those hands and kind of raise their aces hands. And that's why I give this background on this particular guy. Playing a level up, has a lot of money, and he's raising anyways. The reason why that's important is because, and his stack depth, is because when we 3-bet and get the small blind out, if he 4-bets, we can easily call. If he 4-bets pots, and I knew that because of the way that our hand sort of interacts with his hand and his most likely holding, which is aces. And I learned a lot of things about equities in this particular hand. The thing about running PLO equities that's a little bit different than no limit is because you don't know somebody else's suits. Like, if you're looking like at a situation where in Hold'em, you flop an open, a flush draw and a gut shot, and you think a guy has aces. Well, even though you don't know the suits of his aces, you can pretty much put like a flush draw and a gut shot into a calculator and figure out the equity very, very close. Like the suit of his aces like only really changes the equation by maybe 1-2% maximum. But in PLO, because you don't know the suits of the guy's hands, the range of sort of the equity range can actually shift like 5-6% depending on what he actually has. So I'm going to be giving sort of equity ranges after I put it in to this calculator. But one of the things first off, though, to note is a hand like 7-8-4-5 heads up against aces in PLO, double suited like this, is usually going to have at least 45% equity anyways, if you were to run hot cold like all 5 cards. The reason why that's important is if you're ever short stacking PLO and you can get into a situation where you know a guy has aces and you can drive everybody else out of the pot and there's a lot of dead money out there, it becomes a profitable play because you're getting yourself into a 55-45, but you're getting a better price than 55-45. So sometimes you'll see somebody like call back raise to get it all in. And it can sometimes be believable because sometimes people will call with aces and then back raise with them too. So that's just one thing of note. But I knew we had the stack depth where I want to drive this guy out of the small blind. And if this guy repots, I can easily call in position. And that's exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. So he raises to 40. I 3-bet with 7-8-5-4 double suited hearts and clubs to 130. The small blind folds. And he comes back and he repot 4-bets to 400. Now, for a guy playing up a level, this is probably going to be aces like 90% of the time. And I'm like, I've got an aces cracker hand. I've got position. Obviously, I'm going to call here. And that's exactly what I did. Flip this around to no limit. And if you 3-bet 7-6 suited and the small blind folds and then a guy 4-bets, you might not be able to call, with stacked up. Now, it is a direct suited connector, but it's just the equities run far, far closer in PLO with these types of holdings. So I call the 4-bet pot to 400 and the pot to 800. And we only have about a pot and a half left. And this is where really advanced players know. And I was talking to our PLO coach Terp about this. Like they know how much they need to get into the pot pre-flop to go on certain boards and which boards to go on with certain types of aces and the board textures and things like that. Obviously, I don't think this guy had any clue. So I'm in there, the pot to 800. The flop comes out, jack of clubs, 6 of spades, 3 of hearts. And then the guy just comes out and he immediately pots, right? Leaving 400 behind. So obviously we just treat that as an all-in. Whenever you're in a situation where a guy commits themselves, I think the easiest thing is to like treat it as an all-in. So in essence here, he's betting like 1,200 into 800 because the pot's 800, he's potting, but he only has 400 left. So it's really the way I look at it for the math is the pot's going to be 2,000 and it's 800 for me to call. It's 2,000 and it's 1,200 for me to call. So I'd be getting a little bit less than obviously 2-1, but I would getting better than 1.5 to 1, probably like high 30s in terms of equity that I would need. And again, if you want to do the math on that to figure out the equity needed, what you would do, again, if the pot is 2,000, 1,200 to call, is you actually put your call amount in. So you add 1,200 to the 2,000, you get 3,200, and then you divide by 1,200, and that's your equity needed. So I looked at the flop and I'm like, oh my God, let me count my outs here really quick. Because I knew I had a gap in my hand, but I knew a 6 was like really key. It's jack 6-3. I have 8-7-5-4. By the way, jack of clubs, 6 of spades, 3 of hearts. So I flopped 2 backdoors too. And again, sort of like Hold'em, you can kind of like count that each backdoor that you have as an out on the flop. So I knew it was open end with 4-5, but I have a 7 in my hand. So I'm counting. I'm like, all right, I've got 4 deuces. I've got 3 sevens. So that's 7 outs. But then I've got this little interior wrap going on here too, where if a 4 comes, I make a straight with 5-7. And then if a 5 comes, I also make a straight with 4-7, but I hold some of the cards in my hand. So 7 outs, deuce and 7, and then count another 3 outs with a 4 and a 5, and you get 13 outs. And then I've got 2 backdoor flush draws, it's like 15 outs. I knew I was definitely over 50% anyways. And then another thing that's a little bit interesting is this hand actually even has a little bit more equity because I wrap around the 6 too, because it's Jack 6-3. I have 8-7-5-4, so I can pick out straight draws on the turn with the 7-8. And again, I've got 2 backdoor flush draws. So I knew I was probably definitely a favorite over aces, but I didn't realize actually how much of a favorite I was. So depending on the suits of the guy's hand, I could have been anywhere from like a 56% against aces to like almost all the way up to 60% on this particular board. So it didn't really matter what he did. So obviously I put it in, and then I actually ran the actual equity against what he was up against, or I had like 56%, and they only let you run it once. And this is where the variance of PLO, the short-term variance, comes in, because in Hold'em, you just don't get into these situations where you are playing 4 stacks all that often in less than 60-40 types of equity matchups. And what I mean by less than that is like anywhere from 40 to 60, like almost a flip. Like it will happen in Hold'em, maybe you get a set in against like an open-ended straight draw, flush draw some of the time, but it just stacks are going in constantly in PLO. And I think this is where when you don't see that many hands live because the game goes slow, it can sometimes deceptively look like you might be kind of running bad. And I know I got an email from an old time subscriber that I'm about to record a response to because he had been running bad a little bit with PLO mixed in with Hold'em. And I think that you have to take this into account. As a Hold'em player, if you start to dabble in PLO, you have to realize that you can run really bad or you can run really good too. You can actually be playing really badly and win a lot. And I've seen it happen many, many times, so it can be somewhat deceptive. Whereas in Hold'em, if you're limping in under the gun with deuce 3 suited, you're never going to win, which is sometimes what we see like the equivalent of when you see some of these hands turned over when people like limp in with them from up front. So obviously I just get it in with this guy. I know he has aces. He 4-bet pre. He raised in 4-bet. Obviously he's got aces, and I get it in with him on Jack 6-3. The turn is the 9 of clubs, which doesn't make my hand, but it brings in the backdoor club draw. And now I almost have a mega, you could call it a mega wrap here, in the sense that any card below a 10, the board now is Jack 6-3-9, and I have 8-7-5-4. Any card below a 10 is going to give me a straight. A 10, an 8, some of them are not straights, a 7, a 5, a 4, or a deuce. They're all going to give me straights, and I pick up backdoor clubs, which is also interesting because if we had more stacked up, I'll talk about this in a second, how do you proceed in certain situations. But I'm still not, I still haven't made my hand, but I know it made a boatload of equity. And then the river came out the queen of clubs. So it's Jack 6-3, 9 of clubs, queen of clubs. So I make a backdoor flush with my 5-high flush. And I say, I made a flush, and I turn my hand over. It's kind of funny because usually you can, in Hold'em, sometimes I'll wait in a given situation. Sometimes I won't, but I never actually got to see what the guy had. It's pretty obvious that he had aces and he didn't have clubs, and I won. And that's a huge, huge pot, right? Even though it was like 56%, the pot was like $3,300. And one of the other things too that you have to understand, even when you're a big, big favorite in a given setup, if you're trying to figure out if you're running well or running badly, is anytime you win a pot, as long as your opponent has some equity, you are running above expectation. So if you get it in with aces against kings and Hold'em for a total pot size of $1,000, your equity in the pot is only $820. If you win the pot, you are running $180 over expectation. So even when you're a big favorite and you win, you're running well, you're actually running above expectation. Here, it's huge, right? Because if I'm 55% in, say, like a $3,000 pot, my expectation is only like, a little over $1,600. But when you run it once, there's only 2 outcomes, right? You're either going to win the whole pot or go down to 0. So now I'm running way above expectation. What else? The other things that I found that was interesting about this hand, because again, I knew the guy had aces, right? But say, for example, somehow randomly, like he had Jack, Jack, like he had ace, ace, Jack, Jack, or something like that. Like he had ace, ace, Jack, Jack. On the flop, depending on the suits that he holds in his hand of the ace, ace, jack, jack, we have at a minimum 40% equity all the way up to a maximum of 47% equity. 47% equity against top set. And that would be if he specifically had like ace, jack of diamonds where there's no diamond on the flop. And then he had like ace of spades, jack of hearts where he doesn't have any type of backdoor, whatsoever. That's like 47%, all the way down to 40% is if he covers my backdoors, like if he has ace, jack of hearts and ace, jack of clubs. Or something, or I guess he couldn't have ace jack of clubs, but if he has a backdoor of himself, like ace jack of spades. So there's this equity range, but obviously I would always have the equity because I only need high 30s anyways, right? That's the best case scenario for that guy. The interesting thing here is moving to the turn when the turn was the 9 of clubs, which I knew was a huge card for me. So it's jack of clubs, 6 of spades, 3 of hearts, 9 of clubs. I pick up a backdoor club draw. If he had like the best aces for me, the ace, ace, jack, jack, like with the ace, jack of diamonds, my equity goes up to 57%. With 8, 7 of hearts, 5, 4 of clubs on jack, 6, 3, 9 of clubs, I am 57% with one card to come against top set with my mega wrap and club, backdoor club holding. Again, the equities can change depending on what he has in his hand. And that all goes back to that whole thing that I always talk about, like in any form of hold'em, which PLO is a form of hold'em. Of course, hold'em mean like you're playing this game where you're playing the board. 3 jacks can never be the nuts. The lowest nut hand in any form of hold'em is 3 queens. And the reason why that is because if the highest card on the board is a jack, and the board is not paired, there will be a straight out there. So 3 jacks can never be the nuts. 3 queens can be the nuts, but 3 jacks can never be the nuts in a given situation. So my equity would have obviously gone up. Now, I had a buddy of mine say, well, say this hand plays out differently. Say he only bet like really small on the flop, like 250, 300. Say he hadn't potted it, what would you have done? And I think the response is like, okay, well, anytime you're going to be at least a 55% sort of favorite in a given scenario. If you think there's any type of fold equity, the play would be to jam. But there are certain extreme situations, and I'll sort of set this up, where a guy has top set. Say somehow like we got into this hand where it wasn't multi-way in this particular situation, and we got the same flop, and maybe the pre-flop raiser bet, and then like this crusty OMC guy who was in the hand, raised on jack 6-3. And he 100%, he has pocket jacks. And you thought that the other guy wasn't going to get involved with aces, like basically, facing that board. So you're really only worried about the crusty guy. And you had a hand like 7-8, 5-4, where you're a dog against pocket jacks. This is a time in PLO that's a little bit different than in Hold'em, where you burn a card off, meaning like you wait, like you call the raise. And then if the board doesn't pair on the turn, you go with your hand. And that's because when someone's got a set in PLO on the flop and you've got a gigantic draw, if the board pairs, your equity goes down to 0. But if the board doesn't pair, in this particular situation, if the board doesn't pair, even in the worst case scenarios of like it coming maybe like a high offsuit card, I'm still going to have like 33% equity where I can call a pot size bet. But the point is that it's a sort of a more profitable approach as you get into this game to sometimes not go with a mega draw on the flop if you absolutely know somebody has top set and their stack depth. You want to wait so that the board doesn't pair. You want to wait so the board doesn't pair. So if I was ever in this situation where that happened and and somebody bet the flop for pot or something like that, and like say it was like an ace high board instead of a jack high board, and I knew he had 3 aces, but I still had a shit ton of equity against top set, I would just call the flop and wait for the board not to pair on the turn and then go with the hand. But that was a huge hand that I won in that. And again, like I was up 2,000 for the whole session, but that kind of made my session. So that was the most interesting hand. Learning about the equities, thinking about what I would do, saying that it's absolutely forced that I would absolutely want to 3-bet that hand. And that goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning, where you have these hands like 7-8, 5-4 suited, where say 3 people limp in from up front and I have that hand on the button. I know those guys aren't going to fold. So I might just get in cheaply. However, if someone raises, it's a mandatory 3-bet, especially if no one calls in between. It's a mandatory 3-bet. So it's a hand that I over limp because I'm not going to get folds in a single raise, but it's a mandatory 3-bet, which is funny because the next hand, number 10, plays right into that. So in a straddle pot, there was one limper, and the crusty old guy in seat 9 raised 250. Now we were both at least 2,000 effective, and I was in like the hijack, and I had 8, 7, 6, 5. This time only single suited, so this is more of a straight rundown. 8, 7, 6, 5, no gaps. I was like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We have stacked it. This is a mandatory 3-bet. So I 3-bet him. I went up to 175. There was that limper in there. Actually, I think I might have went up to 200. There was that limper up there, in there. Everybody folds, and he calls. Because if you were to just call with that hand, again, you'd have to worry about making ass end side of straights, things like that. This guy calls, and we're heads up. What's funny is the board comes out 7-5-4 rainbow. So I just smack it. Remember, he just called the 3-bet. I just smacked the flop. Now, I don't know if this guy's always 4-betting aces because he could have bad aces or something like that, and he knows enough to just call with them, or if he's got like a high rundown type of hand. But it comes out 7-5-4. I flop the nuts, and I flop top 2. I've got 8-6 in my hand, 7-5-4, and I've got top 2. And he checks. And the pot is like 400. Now, I almost couldn't believe it because it really happened like back to back. And I'm like, all right, I'm just going to sort of bet small. And I hope that maybe, this guy's going to continue or make a play at me. I bet 150 and he just folded. And the reason why I kind of bring this hand up, besides the fact that I smacked the nuts is, and I don't know the answer to this, is like, is there ever a time to slow play in PLO in this particular situation? Because thinking about what would I actually do if I had like ace, ace, king, king here, would I be doing a lot of checking back? Maybe I'd be betting sometimes for protection like this. This is what I wanted to make it look like. But if I've smacked the nuts here and he's got like high cards or something like that, do I want to let him catch up? Is there this time maybe where I would slow play here in Jack 5-4? I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I bet 150. He just folded. Obviously, I was a little bit disappointed with that. And then finally, this is going to be at the halfway mark. This is number 11. This is a hold'em hand. This is a play that I don't necessarily get to implement all that often, but it is something I think that you should have in your arsenal. So we'll talk about the lesson here in a second. This hand was played against a guy that was down quite a bit. I don't know if I think he was sort of a straight PLO player, so he might have been waiting for 2-2, but I knew he was a little bit action, like all the guys at the table knew him. And he had just lost several pots, and he actually lost a fairly large one to me in the double board rounds. I mean, again, there's a reason why I haven't brought any double board hands in here because I'm doing them for the videos. So he was down a little bit. And this hand goes down where we're about like $1,000 effective. It's a straddle pot, and small blind makes it 30. So it gets folded around once again, and he's to my immediate right. He goes 30. I'm in the big blind. I'm in the middle blind. And this is like, really, I was just sitting there and I was like, man, I haven't gotten any hold'em hands. I mean, we talked about 3 hold'em hands, but they weren't like anything that was crazy. It was ace 10, 9, 10, and queen jack, right? So this is like 2.5 hours, 3 hours into the session. I finally pick up a hold'em premium hand. I have ace king off. So he goes 30 in the small blind. Obviously, I 3-bet to 100 in the big blind with ace of hearts, king of spades. Remember, the guy to my left, who is the fish, he's in the straddle. Well, he cold calls. Same thing, that we've been seeing. He cold calls. And then I was hoping that this small blind might have been tilty and was going to rejam. And I was definitely going to get it in with him for sure in the setup if I thought it was kind of tilty. But he also calls. And we go to the flop 3 ways. I've got ace, king, small blind, big blind, straddle, 3-bet pot. I'm 1,000 effective with the small blind, and I'm 2,000 effective with the guy who's the fishy guy in the straddle. The board comes out Jack, Jack 4 with 2 hearts. Now I've got ace, king with the ace of hearts. These ones are always a little bit tricky when you start to think about structuring because of your nut suit. I'm talking about on a paired board. On a paired board that is high where somebody could have trips. Not all paired boards are equal. Like what I'm about to say doesn't really come into play if the board instead was Jack deuce deuce instead of like Jack Jack 4 or even like Jack 4-4. This is legitimate. Somebody could have a Jack here. And of course, when you're thinking about like structuring, Cbet bluffing matrix here, it's a 3-bet pot, but we've got 2 people in the hand, which is good. And then, can you represent maybe sometimes like running a bluff across like hearts, but you have to be careful when someone could have trips in a given situation, even though, this configuration is tighter because it's a 3-bet pot. So small blind checks to me again. It's Jack, Jack 4, 2 hearts. I've got Ace King with the Ace of Hearts. Small blind checks to me. I bet 125. This is kind of a rangy type of bet, sort of protection-ish type of bet, right? But again, more of a volume bet. And when I talk about a volume bet, it's like a range bet. Like it's like this bet is going to usually just show a higher expectation. It's not quite as clear cut as, oh, I'm betting for value or as a bluff. It's usually it allows me to realize my equity more. Because if the guy to my left folds out, even if the small blind calls, I can figure out what I'm going to do on the turn. And we've mathematically proven that in the fast track course curriculum. Well, in basic concepts, I talk about why so much and why so much revisited. Why so much revisited talks about like these types of in-between volume range bets and how they show an overall profit. It usually has to do with realizing your equity. So check, I go 125, small blind folds, which is great. That's exactly what I wanted. And then the fishy straddle folds, which is exactly what I wanted. And then the small blind calls. So the small blind calls. So now we're at 550. This is where it really kind of gets interesting. The turn is the 3 of hearts. So the front door comes in. I have Ace King with the Ace of Hearts. However, even though it was somewhat of a low board, it sort of is it's not a high card. So when you start to think about what is the small blind here like calling with, closing the action, he could be slow playing a jack. Once in a while, he could have a flush draw, but he could also have a pair. Like 7s, 8s, 9s. Who knows? Maybe he could have a hand like 5-4, maybe some other like worse ace highs because he's like closing the action, something like that. But the reason why the 3 of hearts here is different than say like the 10 of hearts, besides the fact that the 10 of hearts would also give me like a gut shot, or the 9 of hearts, is that I still don't think like 7s or 8s are necessarily going to fold, especially with a heart in it. So even though you can make the case, well, you're supposed to structure here if you're c-betting with Ace King with the Ace of Hearts on Jack, Jack 4, what you have to take into account is that this guy could be sandbagging a jack that's just check calling, and also that it's not an overcard here. Like it's below some of the pocket pairs that he might hold. So for those reasons, I actually decided to check back the turn. And what I find kind of interesting about this hand, though, is that even though I check back the turn, that doesn't mean that I don't have anything, even though I don't have anything in this case, because how might I play like black aces? How might I play black kings, right? Maybe I make this size bet on the flop, which I did. But now, after the small blind calls, the turn is a heart. Say I had black aces or black kings, and I'm thinking about the types of hands that he might be check calling with on the flop. Well, it could be Jack X. It could be a flush draw. And again, it could be like weaker types of holdings, but I think we would all agree we'd probably be doing a lot of checking if we had black aces or black kings in this setup on this turn card. But that doesn't mean that we don't have nothing, right? So keep that in mind. So I check it back. It's not like we're checking a brick on like a board of like Jack 9 deuce 3. Usually, if I bet Jack 9 deuce and somebody calls me and the turn's a 3 and I check it back, it usually does mean that I don't have at least top pair. Not the case in this situation. So he checks, and for those reasons, I check it back. Now, I've got the 1 card nut flush draw. Jack, Jack, 4, 3. The river rolls off a black deuce for a final board of Jack, Jack, 4, 3, deuce. Now, if my opponent came out and bet, I would just fold for the most part. I would give him a jack. I'd give him a flush. I don't think he's necessarily bluffing. I would just give it to him. But he checks. So he check called the flop, Jack, Jack, 4. Turns the 3 of hearts, it went check, check, river is a black deuce, and now he checks. And I guess my question for you guys is that, do we have enough showdown value to check back? And I don't think so. Unless the guy is totally out to lunch here. I mean, maybe once in a while, like we beat like ace queen or something like that. But I think assuming that he's not like floating with some bullshit, although we still beat the floats. But remember, those hands are probably forced to black. Like say he called on the flop with king queen. If he called on the flop with king queen on Jack, Jack, 4, turns at 3 and it went check, check, and now the river's a deuce, he's going to bluff the river, right? So when he checked, I was like, wow, maybe the only thing I beat here is like ace queen. I need to bluff here. I need to bluff. And the reason, and this is what I like to call a delayed double barrel. This is a delayed double barrel. Now, usually when I talk about delayed double barrels, it's in somewhat of a different context. when I define delayed double barrels and when I've done entire episodes, and again, there's a robust search function on the site where you can go in to the search box in the top right and search on delayed double barrel, and there'll be episodes. And I know back in the day I've done a few on delayed double barrel. Usually when I talk about delayed double barrel, it's usually checking back a turn card that is actually a good barrel card for you. Instead of barreling it, checking it back to see what your opponent does. And then if they check to you on the river, then you bluff. And the best example I can sort of give, and the reason why you do that is usually in single raise pots on paired boards where you think your opponent could have trips or he just has a weak hand. So say, for example, the board, we raised from somewhat late position and the big blind called. And the big blind calls very, very wide. And the board came out like Jack 6-6, okay? And let's say that we held King Queen suited with the backdoor. So it comes out Jack 6-6. He checks, we make a Cbet with our backdoors, and he calls. And now the turn is an ace, and he checks. This is the example I use with delayed double barrel because traditionally you'd think, okay, like this is a great barrel card for us here, right? Actually, I want to change that around. Say we held ace 10 and it was Jack 6-6. And we see bet the flop and he called and the turn was a king. The reason why this example is better is because sometimes people will piece off with ace highs. Aces are a little bit different because you might actually run into an ace high. But say we held ace 10 and it came Jack 6-6. He check called the flop, turns a king, and he checks. Traditionally, this is a great double barrel card for us, right? Because we might get a lot of Jack X to fold. They might not get involved. We pick up a gut shot. And then, like hands like pocket sevens and stuff like that are going to fold. But his range isn't just Jack X. It could be a 6. So instead of barreling what is a good double barrel card, we actually check behind on Jack 6-6 king. And then if he checks the river, now we bet. And that's that will even sometimes even a jack to fold out more often than on the turn. So when we think our opponent is very strong or very weak, we implement this play and check back turn. And then normally what we do is we just give it up if he bets from up front. Of course, things are different if there's like some sort of front draw or draw that missed. But then if he checks, now we bluff. That's sort of my classic definition of delayed double barrel. In this particular case, it's still another delayed double barrel on Jack 4-3. But it's just sort of turned around because we're checking back a lot of sort of one pair hands on that traditional turn card. So now when the river's a deuce and he checks again, I feel like I have to bluff, but I think I can credibly bluff because I think I would play an overpair like this a lot. And even if he had like, say, something like pocket fives, look at this setup. Let's say he raises with, say, pocket fives through pocket eights and the small blind I 3-bet, the fish calls, and he calls. And it comes out Jack 4. He's got, again, fives through eights. Check, I bet, fish folds, he calls. Turns the 3 of hearts, brings in the front door heart draw. He checks, I think for a while and check it back. That does not mean that I have nothing. He's got fives through eights, and now the river's a deuce, so it's Jack 4, 3 deuce. And of course, what would you do with fives through eights there? You'd probably check because you can't go for value because you know that I could have overpairs that I'm checking back on the turn. So you check, and now I bet. So I checked back the turn, and now I bet. Are fives through eights good there? Usually not. That's why I thought that this was a credible sort of delayed double barrel. And I bet. And I went 325. So the pot was 550. I went 325, which might have kind of been a little bit on the larger side. I just wanted to make it look like it was a value bet. But he tanked for a while and he thought about it. And then he's like, do you have a pair? Do you have a pair? I'm folding a pair. And I believe him. I don't think he was tanking with ace queen. And then he finally folded. So that's one, again, where you don't want to get lazy. And I had a plan for this. And it's interesting because as I was sort of structuring with the ace of hearts on Jack 4, 2 hearts, you can see how every single situation and every card matters because maybe I do more betting on the turn if it was like the 9 of hearts as opposed to the 3 of hearts, in a given situation. But I have to take into account that it's Jack 4, not Jack 4, 4. Because if it was Jack 4, 4 with 2 hearts and I bet the flop and then he called, and the turn was like the 9 or the 10 of hearts, I might, or the turn was the queen of hearts, of course I'm going to barrel the turn because I'm not really concerned about him having 4x because of the 3-bet pot. But on Jack 4, it's definitely different. Anyways, guys, well, we went pretty long here. That's going to wrap it up. We'll be back for part 2 next week. Thank you guys very much for being subscribers, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.